Welcome to American Catechism, episode number 37 by Stab the Dragon Productions. Coming to you from Fort Worth, Texas on Thursday, December 4th, 2025, where it is currently 43 degrees and drizzle. Joy. American Catechism is all about studying American history, the history of Western civilization, our politics, our theology, our culture, and along the way, some good whiskey, hopefully. Today's show is what I call a whiskey holiday, a day that is specifically related to whiskey in some way and is a part of American history, politics, or theology. This is an incredibly rich and complex topic today, and we're just going to briefly touch on it. We're talking about Prohibition and Repeal Day, which is tomorrow, December 5th. The whiskey we'll be studying along with this topic is Old Forester 1920 Prohibition-style straight bourbon. So first, let's examine the history of Prohibition, and then we'll look at the whiskey. The temperance movement. We just celebrated Thanksgiving, and we looked at the Pilgrims a little bit in Plymouth Colony back in 1620 to 21. They did not plant hops for the making of beer, as they had just been through a long, rough journey across the Atlantic, and then they landed here at the start of winter. Harsh winter of starvation, illness, extremely cold weather. They planted corn, fruit trees, vegetables. So at the first Thanksgiving the following year, November 1621, they did have some hard apple cider, fermented apple cider with a low alcohol by volume. And that alcohol was enough to keep the cider from going bad. And that's how they made beer as well. But this fermented apple cider had nutrition to it, and they were used to apple cider in England as well as the beer because the water in England was bad. The water they discovered in America was good water, but it was just part of their culture to have hard apple cider or beer. Now, Christians, conservative Bible-believing Christians of England and Europe at the time, drank beer, cider. The Pilgrims were one of the most strict religious Protestant sects of their day. Wine was regularly consumed. Fermentation is what preserved fruit juice, grapes, and grain. Even children drank mild alcoholic drinks. And in America, apples abounded naturally. So apple cider was, of course, the first alcoholic drink that they had, and applejack or distilled brandy soon followed. And as the colonies grew, fruit orchards grew with them, along with the use of corn and rye and wheat. Following on, so from hard cider and beer, you get whiskey. And then, of course, from the Caribbean, they're importing molasses, sugar, and rum. So the rum trade became very critical in early American colonies. But then the corn and the first whiskeys were rye because they were used to that in Scotland and England and Germany. But then as they learned to adapt to corn whiskeys soon followed. And then by the early 1800s, the bourbon industry began. Alcoholic consumption, though, by the mid-1700s, the average New Englander consumed about 35 gallons of hard apple or peach cider per year, along with rum. And by the early 1800s, they were drinking about 3.5 bottles of hard liquor per week per household. That's a lot. Needless to say, alcoholism was rampant in America by the late 18th and early 19th centuries. That, combined with the Great Awakening and the Second Great Awakening, produced a temperance movement. So you had a religious movement spread throughout early America, combined with looking at the alcohol problem, and so you get this temperance movement. There was a combination of social pressure, religious pressure, and political pressure all combining together. And so it was a widespread campaign to reduce drunkenness in America and to even practice teetotalism, completely abstaining from all forms of alcohol. In 1826, the American Temperance Society was formed in Boston. The early temperance movement focused on moral reform, salvation, and moderation, but not total abstinence yet. But as time passed, the reform movement grew steadily more demanding, more radical. Radicals began taking over, and it turned into this political movement that really took over and just said, okay, teetotalism is the way to go. So then you get prohibition movements. By the middle of the 1800s, there were some cities beginning to experiment with prohibition. And of course, it then spread to some entire states. The great whiskey entrepreneur Hiram Walker had an established business in Detroit, but due to an early form of prohibition in Detroit, he had to move his distilling operations across the Detroit River into Windsor, Ontario, Canada, and that was in 1858. His brand of whiskey became known as Canadian Club. There you go. So Canadian Club whiskey is really rooted in the prohibition movement in early Detroit. The religious and political fervor of this temperance movement culminated in the 18th Amendment being passed in 1919, authorizing the Volstead Act, which began to be enforced in January of 1920. And this act banned the manufacture, import, and sale of alcoholic drinks throughout America. Its intended target was the masses in the cities, the immigrants, the lower to middle classes. The upper class always had access to quality alcohol, believe me. You know, the upper classes had one set of rules, lower classes, we have another set of rules. And then there's homemade stills begin to spring up everywhere, and bathtub gin. And you had the rum runners parked just across the 12-mile limit offshore, or they came across the borders in the Great Lakes from Canada or across the border from Mexico. The organized crime syndicates, of course, the mafia, the gangsters, the bootleggers, they sprang up immediately, and a huge wave of crime entered the picture. This was the Jazz Age, the post-World War I era of the Great Gatsby. There and there. By F. Scott Fitzgerald. Well, after so many years of prohibition, the repeal movement began because the stark reality was that Americans wanted their wine, champagne, beer, gin, and whiskey. And the side effects of prohibition enforcement proved too costly. The Great Depression, in fact, there's a book here. Yeah. The War on Alcohol takes a political look at prohibition and looks at how the state grew in power and law enforcement. I mean, the FBI basically was created to enforce this. The ATF, I mean, you know, Leviathan state really took over because of this. But, you know, the government was missing out on tax revenues, and the Great Depression hit. So former jobs and income of the alcohol industry were missed, as was the tax revenue. Likely the biggest cause for repeal was the government was trying to spend their way out of depression, and they needed the revenue. So finally, on December 5th, which is going to be tomorrow, 1933, the 21st Amendment repealed the 18th Amendment, and prohibition ended. But it took a long time, many years, for the industry to pick back up, borrow money, rebuild distilleries, build up stock of aging bourbon, let it rest for long enough to be good. And then, of course, World War II hit. And again, production took a major hit, shifting towards supplying industrial alcohol for the war effort. Many scores of distilleries in Ireland and Scotland went bust because of the quadruple hit of World War I, Prohibition in America, Great Depression, and then World War II. Conclusion. Yes, America did have an alcohol problem in the early 1800s for sure. Alcoholism and the other bad effects of alcohol will always be with us. But today, the larger problem does seem to be the drug problem, which affects us much worse. Alcohol consumed in the right manner is not the problem. And so if you outlaw something that is actually morally neutral, instead of enforcing the law against those who have the problem, then you create more problems than you solve. So now to the whiskey. Old Forester, 1920. This straight bourbon comes in at a whopping 115 proof, yet I find it to be very drinkable and a good value of about $60 here in Fort Worth. Tasting notes. This has some caramel or brown sugar, wood, spices, leather, nutty, dark fruits like figs or plums. To me, this is delicious. It's a keeper. I gave it a score of 91. Letter grade for drinkability, A+. My recommendation, if you like high-proof bourbons, you should buy this one. Details. History. Coming from the Brown-Forman Company in Louisville, Kentucky, this brand was founded in 1870 by George Gavin Brown, a pharmaceutical salesman who started the brand with sealed bottles, the first to do so. In fact, I think that's here on the bottle. It says the first bottled bourbon. I don't know if you can read that. There, right at the top. And so they're mighty proud of that. And that is a great innovation because what was happening is that distilleries would make whiskey and then sell it in jugs, barrels. And so you would have barrels just roaming around loose out there, and people would cut it. They would add stuff to it. They would corrupt it in some way or fashion. And so what came from the distillery and what you got in a saloon or a store may not be the same thing at all. And so Foreman said, we're going to go modernize and we're going to bottle these products at the distillery. So that's what they did. And this bourbon has been on the market continuously since 1870. It's never been out of production. So that's 155 years. During Prohibition, they received one of the handful of certificates to allow medicinal purpose for making bourbon. So there you go. George G. Brown's descendants are still involved and own the company. It is a still privately owned company. And in 1890, Brown brought in a friend and accountant, George Foreman. So that's why it's Brown Forman. In 1901, they bought the Mattingly Distillery and began distilling their own brand. By 1920, Owsley Brown, the son of the founder, obtained a license to produce the medicinal alcohol during Prohibition. And during World War II, they only produced industrial-grade alcohol for the war effort. In 1956, they bought Jack Daniel's brand. In 1971, they bought Canadian Mist brand and their distillery in Canada. But they sold that in 2020. They also own Woodford Reserve, one of my favorites. Slane Irish whiskey and a handful of scotches. This 1920 expression was released in the year 2016. It's part of the Whiskey Row series. So for history, 5 points out of 5. Bottle label and marketing. You've got the classic bottle shape. It's round, with a larger, heavier base down here. Slightly flared up to the shoulders, and then a tapered neck. You've got a real cork stopper. The label I find to be attractive, even though it's a little bit on the simple side. It's kind of an old-timey font. It's shadowed. The color scheme is black and gold, turquoise, and white background. Fairly simple, yet classy. Notice how the strip there matches this liner around there and the wording there. They're all turquoise. And the rest of the Whiskey Row series has their own color schemes, each one. So that's kind of a classy touch. And they're mighty proud of their proof point there, 115 in bold. So really, it's a very nice bottle and label, I think. Now, I've not really seen any advertisements for this, but over the years, Old Forester's talked about a lot in the whiskey community. I obviously have this Old Forester sign above me right there also. I did do some research on YouTube and found several Old Forester ads from a few years ago. One fairly recently, about a year ago, and one specifically for the 1920 expression, and then another one for the whole Whiskey Row series. That all those ads were pretty good. Now I don't know who makes those ads. None of them said put out by Old Forester. There was different names with some of these. So I don't know if they were an advertisement company that Old Forester hired or if they just did it on their own for fun. Who knows? But the ads that I saw were all pretty good and on point. So for bottle, label, and marketing, 5 out of 5 points. Appearance of this whiskey, well, it's fairly dark. That's a strong 3 in the glass. That's real close to a 4. That'd be a 3.5. That's real close to a 4. But I'm giving it a 3. Composition, 72% corn, 18% rye, 10% malted barley, and of course it weighs in at 115 proof. No details about what strains of corn, rye, or barley were used. See, the craft whiskey industry does that. They'll tell you, hey, we use this kind of barley and this kind of corn. But the big boys, they don't bother. No age statement is provided, but as a straight bourbon with no age statement, it must be 4 years old or older. So for composition, 13 out of 15. The nose, it's got a good strong bourbon smell. Sweet, corn. Getting a little bit of wood on the nose. Maybe some dark fruits and spices. So really, it's an attractive nose. 8 out of 10. And the taste. Now, I am not a fan of the Old Forester 86 proof or the 100 proof. They're standard issues. But this bourbon, coming in at 115, is a favorite. So how does that work? Tell me. I don't know. I think the mash bills are the same. The high proof settles down the sweetness. The 86 and the 100 proof is too sweet for me in the wrong direction. This 115 adds spiciness and some darker notes. I wonder if it was aged longer, perhaps. I don't know. Now, I love their 100 proof rye. The rye is wonderful. But those lower proof bourbons don't do me at all. But this one is fantastic. I get some caramel, I get some brown sugar, some wood, spices. Leather. It's nutty. Dark fruits, maybe like figs or plums. To me, this is delicious. 23 out of 25 points. Mouthfeel, burn, and finish. It's a rich mouthfeel, and it's got a good burn that goes up in the sinuses a little bit and down the throat just a little bit. But at 115 proof, you would expect more of a burn. So really, for the proof, this is pretty smooth. It does have a long finish that includes some mouth tingles, but the leather, the dark fruits, the burnt sugar, the caramel, the spices, all that kind of lingers. And so this is a very good bourbon. 14 out of 15 for mouthfeel, burn, and finish. So for me, neat or mixer, this is perfect neat. But at this price point of about $60, I personally would not use it in a cocktail. Now, you can do you. I mean, if you want to put a $60 bourbon in a cocktail, great. I mean, because that would I don't have any doubt that would be enjoyable. That would be great. Flavors are strong enough to hold up under ice at this proof. So if I was to drink this on a hot summer day, I would consider actually putting it on ice. And I'm sure the flavors would hold up in a cocktail. It's a personal thing with me. High dollar whiskeys, I don't do cocktails. I just like it neat. So neat or mixer, I'm going to say 5 out of 5. Price, value, and availability. Total Wine had this for $56.99. Specs $63.99. Goody Goody for $57.99 here in Fort Worth. So to me, it's got great value, great flavor, great availability. So that's a 10 out of 10 for price, value, and availability. Bonus, this is now clearly a favorite of mine. It has a rich history, great flavor, good nose, great proof, versatility. So yeah, 5 bonus points out of 5, giving me a total score of a 91 and a letter grade for drinkability an A+. My analysis and recommendation, I was a little bit hesitant to spend $60 for this because I had been so disappointed with the 86 proof and the 100 proof editions. But this was the perfect bourbon to celebrate Repeal Day. I actually got this last year for Repeal Day, and then life happens and couldn't do that one. So I saved it for this year. And boy, am I glad. This is going to be a keeper. But now, I may want to try those other Whiskey Row series whiskeys. Particularly, I think the 1910 and 1897 editions. 1897 is the bottled in bond. The 1910 is a double oaked version. So if you like high proof bourbons, I think this one is well worth your effort. All right, what's coming up next? I think this weekend I've got a lot of family stuff going on, but I might be able to squeeze in an episode of Blended Scotch Reviews. Maybe looking at the Naked Malt, Naked Grouse, and doing a family feud, continuing the family feud with the famous Grouse family. All right, for now, happy Repeal Day. This is Stab the Dragon Productions for American Catechism, out here.